In 1989, Francis Fukuyama famously posited that with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of history was upon us. His argument was threefold: that history records the struggle between ideologies, that in the ideological battle between liberalism and communism, liberalism has won, that it would inevitably expand, and that this would constitute the end of history. While Samuel Huntington and others criticised this argument for the fact that it was naive in thinking that democracy would inevitably expand, there's one crucial claim that Fukuyama makes that has gone unchallenged for 30 years, and that unchallenged nature must end tonight. It is the claim that democracy should expand against the other, whether this other be Cold War Sovietism, whether it be Chinese communism, or whether it be, more recently, people like Huntington have said, Islamic fundamentalism. Well, the end of the Cold War was the end of the US-USSR bipolarity. The ideological bipolarity between democracy and Fukuyama's other remains as strong as ever. The proposition must maintain that dichotomy, as advocating for the fight of these values necessarily implies a worse opposing enemy. In my speech tonight, I hope to convince you of three very simple things. First, that democracy, liberty, and the rule of law are not in themselves values we can confidently and morally defend over a formless other. Second, even if these are values that should expand, that military action will never achieve this, and in fact inherently undermines the values themselves. And finally, that there exists a solution to foreign policy that will do far more to defend our democracies. I entirely agree with what Maya says. I entirely agree that what's happening in potentially Taiwan and Ukraine is a disgrace, but I entirely reject the assertion that she and the proposition must make that to fight for these values is the solution, because it falls by moral triumphalism, and that is the cause of what we've seen happening in Ukraine, as I'll later prove in my speech. But first, it's my duty, and indeed my honor, to introduce you to the proposition speakers. You've first heard from Maya Bodnik from Harvard. Now, having heard her speech, I'm under no surprise that she's speaking on the proposition, on the side of aggressive foreign military intervention. Indeed, having met me merely days ago, having hopped off a plane on Thursday night, she's already launched a near-ballistic tirade on my character and my term. Sultan, who subbed in last night, has already been slandered on the basis of his LinkedIn, and I will tell you, Maya, that he did not run unopposed, he was opposed, and he lost nobly. But I will not stand by. I will not stand by in this House. I shall not stand by in this House, separate from the university, unlike the HPU, which shields itself in Harvard. We are an island, and an aggressive and American university is coming for us, and that is something that we must stand against tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Moreover, I fear that she might be planning to overthrow me, as I saw her at dinner get on very well with her fellow teammate, Ambassador John Bolton. And if she does happen to be planning a coup d'etat, she need look no further to him than for advice. He said, ladies and gentlemen, he said in the wake of the January 6th insurrection, and I quote, "As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work, and we should admire him for that." In fact, we're incredibly lucky to have Mr. Bolton with us tonight. He's made an incredibly strenuous and long journey from America, and he really is the world expert. Indeed, the list of countries that he has fought for democracy in is rivaled in its fullness only by his magnificent moustache. And speaking between the two Americans, we first have Fawzia Koofi, who's an Afghan women's advocate and former vice president of the National Assembly before the fall of Kabul. And after her, Mr. Ryan Salu, who is the former foreign minister of Estonia and was one of the most forceful supporters of Ukraine. What he and Fawzia have in common is a wholehearted dedication to their causes, which is truly admirable, and we're very lucky to have them. Something which is perhaps a rarity in the Oxford Union, between the hacks trying to claim dubious manifesto points and former illustrious presidents making a mockery of themselves by lying in Parliament. Thank you all for your long journeys to be part of this debate. We are very honoured to have you. The proposition's case that you've just heard and will continue to hear rests on the moral claim that democracy can expand by a fight, and crucially, that it ought to. To doubt this logical leap We need only look at the track record of when America and its allies have tried to fight for democracy. The history of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya makes one seriously question to the extent to which the values that America and its allies fight for are the values that we see enacted in their actions. And this is not merely a problem for Western hypocrisy. If you read Putin's pseudo-academic articles on the invasion of Ukraine, he defends it as a democratic exercise to liberate Russians in Ukraine from foreign control. I think if anything can be learned from the last century, it is that an awful lot of harm can be done by those who proclaim to be fighting for liberty, for the rule of law, and for democracy, and that is something that we really need to uncover tonight. The obvious response to this, no doubt, is, of course, that democracy that Putin's talking about is one which is ushered in by tanks, bombs, and the destruction of innocent life, things which seem anathema to our conception of Western liberal democracy. However, this is a response that the proposition loses the ability to make as soon as they sanction those same tanks and those same bombs to destroy those same innocent civilian lives. And yet they ask us to believe that they, in fact, are the good guys, that their democracy is the democratic one, their freedom free, and their laws just. At the crux of the proposition's case is a paradox. The ends they praise are diametrically opposed to the means through which they advocate their achievement. And this brings me to my second argument tonight, that even if democracy ought to expand, that it cannot under the terms of the motion. To try to wriggle free from this paradox, the proposition will tell you that the ends justify the means. I tell you that the means undermine the ends. For lying at the bedrock of the values of democracy, liberty, and the rule of law is one very simple principle that we must accept, that even when an outcome is against our own wishes, we will be able to accept it as legitimate. Whether that is accepting a government as legitimate that you didn't vote for, or respecting the rights of your neighbour, or even accepting a court ruling against you. This is something that is really at the bedrock of liberal democracy. And simply put, this principle cannot be imposed by military force, which seeks to destroy the very opposition that is so crucial to the functioning of that liberal democracy. This country became a liberal democracy 100 years before our French counterparts, not primarily because of our intrinsic superiority, but because unlike our bloodless revolution, the French Revolution sought to build democracy on the beheaded corpses of the nobles who opposed their idea of liberal egalitarianism. A Manichaean chasm was created between la patrie, the nation, and l'ennemi du peuple, the enemy of the people, whereby the former were glorified and the latter killed. When the response to opposition is not rational debate, but the destruction and alienation of that opposition as the evil other, we should little doubt while we move away from the values of 1789, the very values of the proposition praised tonight, and creep inevitably towards the authoritization of Robespierre. When we fight in a foreign land, democracy is not ushered in by the consent of the civic body, but rather those elements that disagree with our conception of democracy are banished from the social contract, attacked and excluded from the benefits and promises that liberal democracy offers. I therefore hardly find it surprising that under these circumstances, when those enemies dismantle that democracy, it is in the same way it was established, by force. And don't just take my word for it. Just look at the fall of Kabul, the collapse of democracy in Iraq, and the unification of communist Vietnam, all just months after the withdrawal of troops. The bar for democracy, liberty, and justice is a high one. It rests upon the fragile acceptance of these values over our own interests. Even in established democracies, this is clearly under threat. I take the events of January 6th, 2021 in America as an immense warning shot as to the fragility of our own democracies. And if we recognize that fragility, we would be foolish to conclude that we have the capacity to brashly extend by force what is already in decline. And the proposition tonight must accept some responsibility for that decline. It is them who have dragged the values of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law through the mud on the battlefields on which they suggest we fight, by using these values to justify the very interventions that undermine them. If your most visceral encounter of freedom and democracy is death and destruction, I highly doubt that you'll be convinced it's a good thing. I'm afraid the other side is the side for intervention. Moreover, the sharp battle that the proposition creates between those shining cities on a hill and those dark, amorphous anti-democracies entrenches the enemies that the proposition sees before it. In 1992, the possibility of Russia embracing liberal democracy was seriously spurned by Bush's State of the Union speech, in which he declared, and I quote, "By the grace of God, America won the Cold War." The moral triumphalism of those words added an ace card to the enemies of democracy by presenting a transition to democracy as an American victory and therefore a defeat to the Soviets. The continuation and eastward expansion of NATO, an alliance designed solely for the purpose of defeating the USSR, must be attributed some responsibility for the entrenchment of violent nationalism in Russia and the subsequent invasion of Ukraine. So finally, I would like to suggest an alternative, that we should fight not for the advancement of normative principles, but rather we should fight solely to protect the sovereignty of the state. Historically, democracy has blossomed not when it's been fought for, but when the expansionist ambitions of other states have been checked. The rise of the democracy in post-Soviet states was not a result of US fighting, but because authoritarian rule had collapsed. The Second World War began, not as Maya says, to defend democracy, otherwise it would have begun many years earlier, but in order to halt the German illegal invasion of Poland. And this is preferable for the exact reason that fighting for democracy is not, because it is morally neutral. Tonight I've asked you to question the moral justification that the proposition's case relies on. But even if you don't want to question it, I think that the last 30 years of foreign policy, from Libya to Iraq and Afghanistan, has compelled the West to question its own morality. One need look no further than this existential loss of all moral security on the part of the US and its allies to explain the apathy of NATO to intervene in the Russian war of aggression. So when you're walking through those doors tonight, do not be fooled by the proposition that a vote for them is a stand against Putin's Russia, a stand for democracy. A vote for the proposition is a vote to morally sanctify an ideological system that has done so much to create the harms of this world and is intellectually bankrupt to respond. I'm an ardent believer in democracy. In fact, so ardent as to realize that democracy cannot be achieved through armed force, because democracy is at its essence a voluntary act of free will. If democracy can only survive by forcefully submitting opposition to its will, then it has already been killed. Its blood is on the hands of the proposition and not the foreign regimes they rail against. I beg you to oppose.